I'm sure there's a lot of Africans that were brought over into slavery, which wasn't right, but they got the gospel when they got here. And you know what? I bet you there's a lot of Africans that if they hadn't have been brought over, not saying it was right, don't misunderstand, not justifying the slavery in the situation, but God, I still believe, used it. And now I'm sure there's a lot of Africans that got the gospel, and they're in heaven right now because they got the gospel. You know, what would be better? For them to have lived their entire life in Africa free, doing their voodoo or whatever, and then dying and going to hell, right? Or what happened? And then they go to heaven. They get the opportunity. Now, again, it doesn't justify it. I'm hitting all this stuff, and I wasn't even looking. Good for me. Got to make sure I don't get too carried away. I want to follow these notes here. So even though God might allow something like that to happen to Africans, there's probably a lot of innocent bystanders too. People that were just born there. They weren't necessarily, there's only so much you could do if you're like a little kid being sold into slavery, right? But man might mean that for evil, but God will mean it for good. That's what happened to Joseph. He was sold into slavery. He didn't do anything to deserve it, right? He was just basically a victim in that situation, right? But it was actually for a greater good, though. Because just like he told his brethren, you know what? You betrayed me. You sold me into slavery. Joseph told his brethren, you meant it for evil, but you know what? God meant it for good, to save much people alive. And you know what? I'm sure there's a lot of Africans that were brought over into slavery, which wasn't right, but they got the gospel when they got here. And you know what? I bet you there's a lot of Africans that if they hadn't have been brought over, not saying it was right, don't misunderstand, not justifying the slavery in the situation, but God, I still believe, used it. And now I'm sure there's a lot of Africans that got the gospel, and they're in heaven right now because they got the gospel. What would be better? For them to have lived their entire life in Africa free, doing their voodoo or whatever, and then dying and going to hell, right? Or what happened? And then they go to heaven. They get the opportunity. Now, again, it doesn't justify it. The ends do not justify the means, but this is how God works. This is what God does in the Bible. And America is going to be judged for this, right? And, so hopefully that all makes sense and you understand this, and you're not, getting your panties all in the water right now. You know what I mean? So the Bible says in Romans 8:28, it says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. You know what? What about the man in the jungle? Well, you know what? God's going to figure out a way to reach him. If he's seeking the truth, it happened in this scenario I'm describing, right? But so going back, so there is no white privilege institutionalized in this country. There is, racism that exists in just individuals' hearts. Acting outside of the law, sure, I'll give you that. But that happens both ways, okay? But is there racism taught in the Bible? No. The Bible does teach a form of slavery, but it's not the same thing that you're thinking of, that you demonize so much. The Bible's type of slavery actually makes sense. You can take that up with God. I think it makes sense, though. And, again, you could do a whole sermon on a lot of these things. And I know Pastor Burns has done a full-length sermon on slavery in the past where he went through and explained this in much more detail if you wanted to check that out, if you were not convinced. But what about just privilege in itself? Does privilege exist? Forget about the white part, okay? Does privilege exist? Do people just treat you better or worse in general? Of course. And because, there's all different types of, opinions that people have or reasons why people would treat you differently. Because guess what? We're not all the same. We're all different. And, people will treat you differently based upon that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but this is just a fact of life. And, we're not all born in the same situation. We're all born with different advantages, and we're all born into different disadvantages. Some people are born into, a poorer or a richer, family or part of the world. Thank God we all are born in America. Most people are probably born in America. I don't know every single person, but we're all in America now, and there's a lot of blessings just associated with that alone, just where you were born. Okay? You could have been born in some other part of the world that just didn't have a lot of advantages there. You could have been born pretty. You could have been born ugly. They're short, tall. smart, dumb, athletic, strong, weak, male, female. Not that one of those is worse or better than the other. You could have been born handicapped, disabled. I mean, there's all kinds of things you could have that you're just born into that you didn't do anything to cause, but it's just your life, okay? There's all kinds of different privileges, and there's all, people could treat you differently based upon all kinds of, all those things.